We're heading into a presidential election season. Well, frankly, we're in the middle of it, but it's easy to overlook the theopolitical as we get fixated on the geopolitical. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. We'll discuss what we mean by theopolitics as we get into this 4-week discussion of the prophetic implications that are unfolding in the news around us and why we need to focus on what's happening with the principalities and powers beyond the range of human sight, because according to Paul, who knew his theology, that's who our real opponents are. Joining me on the panel, this is always fun when we get these three gentlemen together and have the opportunity to talk. This is what really makes my job enjoyable. First, the author of numerous best-selling books, most recently, Gods of the Final Kingdom, Gods and Thrones, Gods of Ground Zero, and his forthcoming book, brand new from Defender Publishing, Masquerade. We welcome Pastor Carl Gallup back to Skywatch TV.
Thank you,
Carl,
Derek.
welcome.
It's great to be with you.
Next, a Pentagon insider who has been with us before, the author of numerous best-selling books, including Alliance of Evil, The Deeper State, and most recently, Progressive Evil. And he's the author of the foreword of the book that'll be the topic of our discussion this week. We welcome Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis back to Skywatch TV. Bob?
Well, thank you very much, Derek.
And the CEO of Skywatch TV, author of numerous best-selling books, and the subject today that takes a hard-hitting look at both the geo and theopolitics around the American political scene and the swamp in Washington, D.C. The new book called Shadowland. We welcome Dr. Thomas Horn back to Skywatch.
Hey, great to be here with you guys.
2017, Donald Trump, at his inaugural, essentially declared war on the deeper state, as Colonel Maginnis puts it. And the deeper state has not wasted a moment in trying to exact its revenge on President Trump since then, has it?
Yeah, that's right. It's been nonstop. But what we do in Shadowland is talk about the fact that there's more than just politics as usual going on here. He swatted at a bee's nest or something in both 2016 and also 2017. But we recognized even back then that besides politics as usual, the Democrats versus the Republicans and whatever, that there was also an occult aspect that remains mostly hidden to most people, even in American culture, even in American churches. They do not recognize that we live within a supernatural world. And you mentioned, the Apostle Paul, when he says that we're at war to the Ephesians with principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. He uses very specific Greek words there, one of which, cosmokrators, actually directly refers to unseen supernaturalism that works in and through human political counterparts. With the United States being the most powerful nation in history, really, it would be very obvious that if the devil wanted to influence global politics and a move towards an antichrist socialistic system, he would be working overtime here in the United States of America. But I think even Newt Gingrich recognized something about Donald Trump when he came in, and he said he made a cryptic phrase. He says he doesn't know the secret handshake, which is a direct reference, right, to some of the Masonic, some of the other stuff that goes on in Washington, D.C., emanating out of the house of the temple that many people believe is the true power source, influence in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, with his inauguration, he instigated something about draining the swamp. But those swamp creatures, we found out, are demon-possessed, and they're not going to go easy.
This is something that I guess would explain the presence of Jeffrey Epstein on the cover of the book here. You really, you would talk about swatting at a bee's nest. You really stick a fork in the hornet's nest here with Shadowland. Referring now specifically to Chapter 5, where you dive deep into the political milieu around Jeffrey Epstein. But this is something that has been talked about in some circles now, as we looked at, and Colonel Maginnis, you've alluded to this too, as in our previous discussions about your book, The Deeper State, that there is an occult underworld, if you will, that is very active inside Washington, D.C.
No, there really is. And by the way, we got our first hints of that during WikiLeaks, right? There's a reason John Podesta is holding up his two hands, and on one hand is a fish, and on the other hand is the number 14. Occultists totally got that, right? It's based on the myth of Osiris and Isis. It's Osiris' evil brother Set. murders him, chops him into 14 pieces, throws him into the Nile. ISIS can only find 13 pieces, can't find the 14th piece, which is his missing male phallus, and thus all through ancient Egypt, Washington, D.C., the Vatican, we have the giant obelisk, which is symbolic of his erect male organ, right? But it is degenerative magic that is based around that ultimately is going to bring back Osiris, who's also, by the way, to the Greeks, Apollyon, Apollo. Revelation 9, a star falls from heaven, having the keys to the bottomless pit, opens it up, and all these transgenic monstrosities come up out of the underworld. But it says they have a king over them down there, whose name is Abaddon. But in his Greek language, Apollyon, and several places in the New Testament, it identifies that as the spirit that is going to inhabit Antichrist. All of this stuff is really at the core of an element in Washington that operates behind the scenes, but they are deeply involved in occult rituals, in sex magic ceremonies dating back at least to the 1940s or earlier than that. And some of these people are true believers. Now, what we do in the book Shadowland, this has never been done. You're not going to find this in print anywhere else. It is literally a world exclusive involving Jeffrey Epstein, the elite individuals around him. And yes, I do name names, dozens of them, including names that are on the growing body count list, right? People are going to be shocked at the dozens of individuals who began doing investigations into some of these power brokers, and oops, suddenly they committed suicide. They didn't seem to have been suicidal, but now all of a sudden they're dead. Or oops, their plane just crashed, and now, oh wait, they fell out of a boat and they're drowned. Or they've disappeared and we've never been able to find, or they were killed by an assassin. I mean, it's over and over and over, and always people who were investigating, doing studies. In the last year, 2 different politicians doing studies into sex trafficking that would have named people inside Washington, D.C. One of them in Oklahoma, the other one in Arkansas. Suddenly, one of them decides to kill himself. The other one's just found dead of a gunshot. So these are very powerful individuals, very powerful people. So we actually name names in this book. But of course, the biggest name is Jeffrey Epstein. And let me just go on record. No, Epstein did not commit suicide. We dedicate a huge part of the book to the forensic evidence and qualified individuals, including the follow-up investigation by Epstein's family attorneys, right, who shows very persuasive evidence that Epstein was strangled to death and didn't commit suicide, including things like the capillaries in his eyeballs busted, and of course several of these pathologists mentioning the thyroid bone, which, you know, there was I think it was in Britain, there was a large study done that showed out of something like 3,700 deaths by suicide, only 2 resulted in breaking the thyroid bone. So there's a lot of evidence here that suggests that something else was going on. But the one part of this book that is going to blow people away, and we certainly don't have time during these television series to go into all of the different elements, but there is an entire chapter dedicated to the occult aspects, occultic designs, symbolism that makes up Epstein's orgy island, Little St. James Island. And once you understand, when you read this book, once you understand what's going on, those things start literally popping out of the book. We provide images. We have, we have drone footage. It just comes off the pages at you as something here was going on that was of the darkest kind of occultic nature. 2 different reports recently where the skulls and bones of children have been recovered from the waters around Epstein Island. When you know that, and when you look at what we provide in this book, you start making a determination that these guys, these elitists, these pedophiles, they were into something far more than just raping babies. They were into some very dark stuff, and I think this is where some of the Mexican girls, a large number of them that have turned up missing and nobody knows where they are, I think this is where they wound up.
We're going to need to take a quick break and tell you how to get a copy of the book Shadowland as part of a special offer from Skywatch TV. When we come back, we'll deal with some of the occult symbolism at Little St. James Island and how this fight to keep all of this hidden from your view is being played out in the news headlines that you are seeing on your television screens and in your newspapers this very day. Skywatch TV continues after this. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. We're in the middle of a discussion of the brand new book by Dr. Tom Horn, Shadowland. Joining me on the panel, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis and Pastor Carl Gallup, as we discuss the principalities and powers behind the theopolitics that is really what's going on, the political things that we see in the news headlines each day, really the shadows of the real events taking place in the spirit realm. Tom, again, you devoted an entire chapter to the occult symbolism on Little St. James Island. I know we can only touch the surface here, but what did you find most striking when you began looking at what Epstein had built on this island?
Yeah, so, well, let's talk about some of the symbols in just a moment. One other final point I didn't get to make before we went to the commercial break is, and I discovered this as I was doing this investigation into Shadowland, and that is what we once knew from the WikiLeaks about the people behind Hillary Clinton and their belief that she was the Hilarion. Mm-hmm. People have to go back and watch our archive shows because we don't have time to go into all of that today, but there's evidence, persuasive evidence, that they believed that she was the incarnation of the Babylon working that began with Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, devotees of Aleister Crowley occultism, where they were trying to open a doorway and bring into this reality the incarnation of the archetype divine feminine, right? The whore of Babylon. And they believed that they did. They named the year 1947 and all this other stuff. In addition to the fact that in 1948, Parsons wrote one of his last little booklets called Book of the Antichrist, in which he said that this little baby girl was now 1 year old, came to him in a vision, said, "I'm here, I'm going to help prepare the world for the coming of Antichrist," right? And oh, by the way, my name is Hilarion, which is the arcane Hillary. And so statistically, when you look at everything that involved the possibility that Hillary Clinton was the fulfillment, you understand where John Podesta, where these people were coming from, why they were flashing these symbols, why they were talking about contiguous aliens, right? And all that kind of stuff. But what I found doing research for Shadowland was that Ghislaine, is that how you say her name?
Ghislaine.
Ghislaine.
Yeah.
Ghislaine Maxwell. I wrote a book about her, but I can't say her name, right?
His father was one of those who drowned mysteriously off of his yacht.
He got too close. But her brother-in-law, Roger Molina's father, was the very man, Frank Molina, who was one of the three original Rocket Men and very good friends with Jack Parsons. So what we uncover in this book that nobody's read anywhere else is that there is a decades-long bloodline going back with people practicing this kind of Aleister Crowley occultism. It's astonishing what we uncovered. I know we'll run out of time. We don't have time to go into all of it. Let's just briefly mention some of the stuff that's on Epstein's Island. So first of all, you have what everybody calls the temple, right? Which I've got photographs of it, but also of the Haman Yalbuga, which is a Mamluk era building that was during a time when war would occur throughout the Middle East, and they would capture children. They'd turn the boys into soldiers, but they'd turn the girls into sex slaves and concubines. And you start with that. Why did Jeffrey Epstein insist on his temple being painted so that it seems to be an identical match to this Mamluk era building? Then there's stuff all over the island that we got off of drone footage. Gargoyles, they're all over the island with a plate, a shield they're holding up in front of them with a six-pointed star. The significance of that is it's not only important, but we know that when you do studies in demonology, you know that demons go where they are invited, right? All occultists know this. Why do you use pentagrams and symbolism and all that? Because it becomes a Mandela. It becomes a device by which you can invite into your sphere evil supernaturalism. Goddesses on the island that protect the entries and the exits of pathways on the island. This goes right into Greek and Egyptian, Babylonian mysticism, the idea that you'd have a goddess like Hecate, right?
Right.
That guards the path of three ways. It's all over the island. There's a great big huge facial image there that I can only imagine is the Green Man, right? And you've done studies about the Green Man in the past.
Yeah, Hernunos is the name that's given to him by the Wiccans, but when you do some research and trace his history back, you find he originates in ancient Anatolia, Turkey, as Kronos, who was the old god of the Greeks, who was overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians, cast down to Tartarus, like the angels who sinned in 2 Peter 2:4, a reference to Genesis 6. The god who ate his children because it was prophesied that they would overthrow him, which is why Kronos, Saturn, Baal, Haman, same entity, different names. It could be another incarnation of Moloch, the god who demanded child
and this
sacrifice.
was the other thing we found. So if you had just a bunch of different kind of symbols, none of which seemed to carry any kind of a common theme, then you say, well, you're kind of reaching to try to make this stuff all look. But no, over and over and over, symbols and even structures that are connected in history to human sacrifice, and particularly the sacrifice of children. When you go back to Kronos, you go to Baal, all of that, the sacrifice of children to these demon gods in order that I might improve my particular standing in life if I gain the favor of these gods that demand, human sacrifice and blood. Huge sundial. And again, we don't have time to go into all of this, but the sundials were developed in Babylonian times, the very purpose of which was to be able to track the movement of the solar deities that they were making human sacrifices to. And this sundial is really particular. It's got what appear to be rune stones at the open mystical hours on the clock. So there was some deeply occultic stuff that was going on there. There's also labyrinthian designs, and not just at Epstein's Island, but also at his New Mexico Zorro Ranch, which at one time was the largest home in New Mexico. Designs that make no sense whatsoever other than they were being used for occult rituals. And you've done research on the whole idea around the labyrinths, right? The Minotaur, to whom, again, what? Children, boys and girls, had to be sacrificed annually.
And again, as with Kronos, there's that bull-like imagery which relates back to the appearance of the cherubim, not all of whom apparently were loyal to God. But yes, there's a belief that the labyrinth was a pathway that had to be navigated in order to make one's way into and then back out of the netherworld.
Right. Now, one other thing I want to just briefly mention. Again, this is hundreds of pages and documents and photos and images. We also are releasing a multi-disc audio set from me, The Hidden Occultism of Epstein's Orgy Island. So they're going to get all of the details, and we're giving that away free with this limited time offer. In a moment, I want to get input from both Carl and Colonel Maginnis on this, but let me just bring up one more. There's a very large berm area on Epstein Island. And back in 2012 and 2013, we were able to get images of this berm area where it showed that you would come through one entry only. The berm walls are 20 foot tall. So you come through into this berm area, and then it went around, and there were 4 distinct pathways that led to an inner circle that had a square in the middle of it. This is an ancient ritualistic pattern that numerous cultures throughout time use specifically for human sacrifices. It's also interesting, going back again to the Podestas and this whole crowd and this decades-long bloodlines of individuals that are trying to seed the human race with evil spirits and demons and all the stuff that they're trying to do. But if you go to Washington, D.C., what do you see? Out in the mall, 4 distinct pathways that lead to a large inner circle, inside of which is the square base of the obelisk of Osiris Apollo. You go to the Vatican, 4 pathways that go to an inner circle, inside of which is the square base. But you can also go to Aztec, other designs where they have these 4 large stairs leading up to an upper square area on top of which human sacrifices were made. These symbols are historic. They have meaning. They have a use. Now, when the investigators began closing in on Jeffrey Epstein and he knew that he was going to be arrested and possibly do prison time, all of a sudden the crawlers are out there. They clean the whole inside of the berm area out, and they put a tennis court in there, right? To make it look like, that's kind of odd, but of all things, you have a tennis court out in the middle of a giant berm area, right?
So you don't lose the ball.
Right, so you don't lose the ball. And then that was removed, and now it's just a big area where they're parking trucks. But we provide the images, and then we provide all of the backstory. I've got people like Judd Burton. I've got other people that are expert in occultism, and they're explaining this. There was some other stuff. Oh, my goodness. One of the bedrooms where there is a large, actually a giant crucified Christ that is hanging up above the bedboard, tilted downhill by wires so that Jesus Christ himself would have to watch as this rape of these children. I mean, they were literally performing the worst kind of dark, black, satanic activity involving redundant numbers of children. We don't even know how many children. So anyway, but we go into all of this symbolism, occultism, so that by the time you get to the end of this, you will be persuaded there's something far more than just rape of children, which is horrific enough in its own. You know, Epstein had even like the triplets, right? The guy that was the directing the models into America's Top Model or whatever the TV program was for his birthday present, sending him 3 impoverished children, 12 or 13 years old, to rape as a birthday party. So,
It's very disturbing, and with just a couple of minutes left, just to get some input from you fellows. Carl, you said before this is the most prophetically significant time since the first century. Does any of this surprise you, given that that's your view on prophecy?
Well, and I come from a law enforcement background as well, so does any of this surprise me? No, but it is stunning. What shocks me is the fact that we are living and ministering and anointed in this as like we've been raised up for such a time as this, our whole generation. And particularly those that are people of God, that are born-again believers in Jesus Christ. And right in the midst of it, all of these biblical prophecies, some of them very direct, some of them a little more indirect, that goes to a lot of this evil we're talking about, but it's all there. The sexual perversion in the last days. The book of Revelation speaks of this. I mean, it's there. The massive amounts of drug abuse globally. See, here's the thing. All of these things we're speaking of have been around since the most ancient of times. But our generation is the first generation in history to be technologically driven in the information communication of it, therefore the spread of it. Now all of these things are ubiquitous, worldwide, global. The literal spirit of Antichrist is now global for the first generation in history. This doesn't even count the fact that we're the first generation to see the return of Israel. We're the first generation to see Jerusalem named as the capital in the American embassy. We're the first generation to see all of these things. Arab Spring, the collapse of the Middle East, collapse of Syria, Turkey heading to an Islamic caliphate. I could go on and on. We're the first generation to see this. We're the first generation to be in the computer age, the cell phone age, satellite technology age, on and on and on. And it's all of this has started congealing 71 years ago when Israel was reborn. We are the generation. Yes, and I could speak on this for hours, but we are we are living in the most prophetic time since the first coming of Jesus Christ.
Colonel Maginnis, with just about a minute, you've been inside Washington, D.C. for a good part of your adult career. Again, any of this surprising to you?
Not at all. That's why I wrote Deeper State.
Right.
Because most people don't understand that we have a truly demonic activity surrounding that power center. You know, I used to wear night vision goggles. If you took them off, you couldn't see. When you put them on, you see everything clearly. You know, those of us that are in Washington and have been for some time are wearing goggles that see the darkness, and that darkness is permeating our very culture, our government. And what Tom brings out, it's shocking, but I don't doubt it.
This is why Paul wrote that we're not wrestling against flesh and blood. Principalities, powers, cosmic rulers over this present darkness. The book is Shadowland, the author, Dr. Tom Horn, and we thank you for watching as we keep watch. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Skywatch TV. Jesus said to suffer the little children to come unto him. It's no surprise then that the occult world, which follows a darker God, has exactly the opposite attitude towards children. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. This will be a disturbing program, which is perhaps why we're offering this as a web exclusive, but it will point to some upcoming broadcast shows from Skywatch TV featuring several new books from Defender Publishing. Joining me on this panel as we discuss the connections between child abuse and the occult. First, the Chief Operating Officer of Skywatch TV and an author in his own right, Joe Artis Horn. Joe,
Hi, Derek.
welcome.
Thank you.
Longtime pastor of Hickory Hammock Baptist Church, best-selling author, his new book, Masquerade, Get Ready for the Greatest Con Job in History. We welcome Pastor Carl Gallups back to Skywatch TV.
Thank you,
Carl.
Derek.
And the subject of this discussion, the CEO of Skywatch TV, best-selling author, and the author of the brand new book, Shadowland. And you can tell by the pictures on the cover of the book where perhaps some of this discussion will be going. We welcome Dr. Tom Horn back to Skywatch TV.
Good to be here, Derek.
This is something that obviously is behind the desire that we at Skywatch TV had, that you and Nita have had, to make Whispering Ponies Ranch available to children at risk, children in foster care who are at much greater risk of being abused for sexual purposes than children from most other families. But across America, it is kind of a dark secret that more children than we realize are being trafficked for sex. This was the subject of the movie by Yaku Buyan's 8
Yes.
Days. Brand new movie now by another publisher or by another producer that is focusing on this subject called Blind Eyes Opened. And this is a dark undercurrent that runs through our nation's capital. In fact, it goes worldwide. As Sharon and I, as we began our podcasting almost 15 years ago, began looking at some of these things, cases from the UK, cases from Belgium, and here in the United States, cases that kind of predate the internet, so they may not be as familiar to our viewers as they are to us. The Franklin Credit Union cover-up, the McMartin preschool case, even the Hosanna Church in 2005, 2006 in Chapatoulas Parish, which inspired the first season of the HBO series True Detective. Occult and children being sexually abused is a connection that we see over and over again, even in modern-day America. And this is something that you delve into quite deeply in your new book, Shadowland.
Well, and it's so widespread. I mean, in Texas alone, 77,000 children a day are sexually abused. In Texas alone. So that it is literally a tsunami of abuse of children today. That's a reality. But there's this other part of it that gets even darker. And it's really not something that we want to talk about, but we have to talk about it. And in this case, with the new book, Shadowland, we do name names, and some of these are very well-known individuals, and they exist in powerful circles. You know, we were with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis yesterday, and we were talking about some of this, and in Shadowland, he wrote the foreword for Shadowland. He's aware, you've read part of it, at least chapter 5,
Yes.
that there is some very dark occult activity there. That really is a takeoff of Aleister Crowley's occultic ideas that the blood of children for occult purposes has a special level of power and influence in the demonic realm. And so the true believers that are part of satanic circles and certain forms of witchcraft and things like that, for them, nothing can give them greater authority and power in the demonic realm than to abuse, perhaps even sacrifice, a young child as a blood offering to the gods that they serve. So it's very dark stuff, and we hate it. But over a year ago, when we put out the book Saboteurs, we found, and of course I know that, you know, the Podestas and the different people that were in there sending emails back and forth around Hillary Clinton and Uba Dean, or whatever her name was, Abedin, the stuff involving, you know, sexual activity towards children. In fact, we have a clip that we want to play here after a little bit. From the IG report on this. But we started over a year ago just examining specifically the WikiLeaks emails that indicated that there was this form of dark occultism. And there's that famous photo that I'm sure John Podesta never thought the public would ever see of him holding up his hands, and he's got the number 14 on one hand and a fish on the other hand. And anybody that knows anything about Osirian witchcraft or Osirian Satanism or even the legend of Osiris immediately recognize what that is, because Osiris is murdered by his wicked brother Set, right? Who has him chopped into 14 pieces. That's why the number 14. They're all thrown into the Nile. Isis, the sister wife of Osiris, the queen of magical skills, right? Goes up and down the Nile River. She recovers 13 of the 14 pieces. The missing part is his phallus, right, which has been ate by a fish. Plutarch says a crocodile, but one way or another, something in the river ate, this part of him. Well, so she puts his body back together, and then creates an obelisk, affixes that as his organ to his ithyphallic corpse, right, and then conducts the raising of Osiris ceremony, the same thing that happens in Washington, D.C. at the House of the Temple at the inauguration of every American president, which draws forth the seed of Osiris from the underworld, right, and magically impregnates her, and she gives birth to Osiris resurrected. So that really formed the basis of Egyptian cosmology, but since then, through the mystery schools, through Rosicrucianism, the Freemasons, that has kind of maintained. In fact, Harem Abif, the second coming of this king of the Freemasons, right, is really all based, according to their own scholars, on this retelling of Osiris and Isis and whatever. Now, we got into that last year, and some other darker stuff, spirit cooking, other stuff that's connected to the Black Mass. Our more recent research, which is in the book Shadowland, carries that forward, Joe, with stuff that would just make you fuming mad. You guys that, well, let's just say you have your ideas around how this could be handled, right? But like one of Epstein's bedrooms, where children were being raped. They intentionally have a giant cross of Jesus Christ above the headboard, then tilted forward and held by wires so that Jesus is looking down on the bed as these children are being raped and molested. It gets much darker. And people are going to find that there's never been a book like Shadowland that's ever been published. But yeah, I mean, the stuff that we reveal, there are reasons why the skulls and the bones of children have been recovered in the waters around Orgy Island, Epstein's island. So anyway, a lot of stuff. But what does this Osiris stuff, what does this have to do with Shadowland? Because we're able to show that there were symbols and architecture on Epstein's island. That's very important if you know what you're looking at, and the occultists do, and then some of us that do this kind of investigative research do, where at one point his giant bermed area in 2012, 2013, there are aerial photographs that show an occult layout inside that 20-foot tall bermed area where you walk in through one common area only, like a gate, then it goes out and around, and it forms 4 paths leading to a circular center that has a square in the middle of it. Now, first of all, that's an ancient occult symbol where that was often used in making human sacrifices, right? But it also happens to be the same pattern. If you're in Washington, D.C., and you walk out into the mall, what do you see? 4 pathways leading to an inner circle, inside of which is the square base of the obelisk of Osiris. It dates back to the stuff that Podesta and all these people were practicing. If you go to the Vatican, it's the same thing. Right there in the middle of St. Peter's Square, 4 paths leading to an inner circle, in which is the square base. But this is all based on both ancient and modern occultism that would be used to put yourself, necromantic stuff, to put yourself into contact with demons, with entities. And Derek, you've written so much about the travelers, right? These rituals to summon these, well, we would call them the spirits of the dead Nephilim,
Exactly
the spirits
right.
of the dead giants.
Exactly right. And that's been documented from texts, pagan texts from about the time of the Judges, where the neighbors of ancient Israel were summoning these spirits through rituals to what they called the tabernacle or the threshing floor of El. And in the book Veneration, Sharon wrote a wonderful chapter on the threshing floor as a portal in the ancient world. It's not a coincidence, we believe, that God directed David to purchase the threshing floor of Araunah on Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple of Solomon was constructed, because that was a point of contact between this world and the next. Well, the pagan point of contact, their threshing floor for their creator God, was Mount Hermon. which is where the Watchers descended and began their program of sexual contact with humans to change the human bloodline. And from those spirits of these giant offspring came the demons that the pagans around ancient Israel believed were their ancestors, believed were their ancestral kings who needed to be venerated, worshipped, and sacrificed to. They found a temple to the so-called Council of the Ditanu, Council of the Titans at ancient Ugarit. The Greeks did not invent their religion. They got it from the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel. We're going to need to take a quick break and tell you how to get a copy of the book Shadowland as part of a special offer from Skywatch TV. And when we come back, we'll deal with some of the occult symbolism at Little St. James Island and how this fight to keep all of this hidden from your view is being played out in the news headlines that you are seeing on your television screens and in your newspapers this very day. Skywatch TV continues after this. One of the things that I thought was really intriguing about Epstein's Island in a disturbing way is that what looks like a temple, and you've got pictures of it in Shadowland. This is the striped building with the keystone shape on top, which is actually a copy of a bathhouse that dates to the Mamluk period of Islamic history. One of the chapters that I included in Bad Moon Rising, which we didn't talk about on our network broadcast because, frankly, it's kind of disturbing and some of our affiliates might not have let us get away with it, is the sexual abuse that is rampant in Islam. And I don't want to, derail the conversation, but I think this gets back to the spirits that are at work behind it. We don't blame the Muslims for what they're doing. It's the principalities and powers, as Paul wrote. They are the true enemy. And one of the spirits that's been at work in this world since 1,000 years before Abraham at least. And as Sharon argues, as argued at the Skywatch TV conference last year, Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, or Ashtoreth in the Bible is arguably the spirit of the age. And I argued in Bad Moon Rising that she's one of the main spirits behind Islam. It is a spirit that is deconstructing what God created and called good. Have you not heard? From the beginning created he them male and female. Well, now, today, we're told it's progressive thought to think it's male, female, and 55 other varieties, according to Facebook. And if you dare misgender someone or dead name someone, you can be banned from social media for being a hater. But that is a demonic spirit and the spirit of this fallen angel who is at work behind this. And I think that's at work in what you're writing about in Shadowland as well. The proper roles of men and women, parents and children, and us as protectors and those who should train up their children in the way they should go, is being deconstructed by this fallen realm to destroy what God created. This all comes back to whose children will be raised up at the last trump. The half-human, half-divine spirits of the Nephilim, or the children that the fully divine, fully man, Son of God came to save through his shed blood. See, that's what this whole war is about.
We believe that these Ditanu, by any other name, the giants, the spirits of the giants, we believe that they are part of future prophecy as well. And it becomes very obvious when you see what was happening at Epstein's Island and in the WikiLeaks scandals and everything else. We're not the only ones that believe that. There are those who worship them, who also believe that they are summoning them for a purpose. And in some cases, they're using the torture porn of children, to put it mildly, in order to elicit the favor of these gods that delight in the death, destruction, blood, torture, pain of whatever is innocent, right? And it's always been the case. Every effort to try to wipe out the birth of the Christ child, it's always been this demonic effort. But back to what you were saying about the Mamluk era, it is impossible to look at Epstein's temple on his island and not see that it was fashioned after the Mamluk era temple, which was a time in which children would be taken during the wars and whatever. The boys would be turned into soldiers. Some of them would be turned into prostitutes too. And the young girls, of course, would be owned as slaves. So he literally has a temple on his building that speaks loudly to those who understand what they're looking at, that this is a temple that is dedicated to the enslavement of children. But let's jump forward to something else. Because in the upcoming programs, by the way, we have a whole month of programs that are going to be playing in March that are going to deal with Shadowland. They also deal with Carl Gallup's new book, which we're going to talk about in another daily here in the next few days, Masquerade. Where all of this is going, but in Shadowland, we do something that nobody's done before. Besides naming names, we actually start peeling the onion layers back on who some of the key players were. Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell. Their connection actually going all the way back to the 1940s with these bloodline families that were conducting sex magic rituals as far back as then, and their ongoing commitment to that. So it's groundbreaking. It is a true investigative expose. But there are people, Joe, that they know key parts of this, and there has been a concerted effort to keep some of this stuff
Absolutely.
Covered up, who some of the key players are, and their connections to crimes against children, right?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that the ones that are trying to help skirt away from the facts are involved themselves,
Right.
as much as fearful for their lives, maybe the lives of their families. But in June of 2018, I just want to show everybody at home a video because it really kind of leaped off the screen when I saw it, because it was one of the only few mentions of anything like this I had seen in mainstream media. And they didn't spend but just a couple of minutes on it, and that was the last anybody talked about this at all. And I went immediately to YouTube and downloaded this video of the Laura Ingraham angle at the time, because I remember thinking, and it may still be available, but I'm going to show it to you in just a sec if you can't find it. Somebody's going to pull this down. This is going to get, buried. But it was right after the Office of Inspector General had released the IG report in June of 2018. Michael Horowitz led that investigation. He reveals his report, and on page 294, and Laura Ingraham is asking a panel of pundits about this, she says that on page 294, he identifies in his own writing Hillary Clinton and Foundation, crime against children. And then he goes on to talk about Anthony Weiner, the mysteriously deleted emails, and the connection to the Clintons.
Thousands of emails.
Thousands of emails, but the impression that the pundits that were trying to put all this together before they had to run to the news and tell everybody what their takeaway was, felt that he was almost obligated to present it because the evidence was so overwhelming and undeniable he had no choice. But the way he did it was to kind of obfuscate, navigate around, and then get past it very
And not
quickly so that there
pursue
wasn't, not pursue it or make it, TV headlines. So there was only a couple of minutes spent on this, and then, that was it. It was as if a black switch had gone on the television, boom. And I don't recall, I think Carl might have a memory of seeing something briefly on Hannity about it, but it was like lost and forgotten instantly, but I didn't forget. So I raced and downloaded it. And I just want you to watch this clip because you may not get another shot to see it. Take a look.
You look at one thing in particular that is stunning in this report and is very ironic. The OIG cannot explain. They said there's no rational explanation why, after they found over 300,000 Clinton emails on the Weiner laptop in late September, the FBI did nothing for a month. I say that it's ironic because it's pretty clear there's a real possibility they did nothing because they thought it would hurt Mrs. Clinton during the election. But by waiting so long, when they finally were pressured by the Southern District of New York and decided they had to act, Director Comey said, well, I had to make my statement because I didn't think, to Congress, because I didn't think we'd finish analyzing the emails before the election. If he had done his job, if they had all done their job in late September when they learned about the Clinton emails on the Weiner laptop, they would have been finished and he wouldn't have made that incredibly damaging announcement. And I think the reason that they just stood down is because they didn't want to hurt Mrs. Clinton. I see no other rational explanation for that, and neither does Mr. Horowitz. He doesn't say we had any proof of it. He just says we can't understand this.
Yeah, we can't explain it.
It's really amazing.
On page 294 of the report, Bobby, there's this, it kind of jumps out of the page at you. It's titled Hillary Clinton and Foundation, Crime Against Children. And it's referencing all the emails that were on this Weiner laptop. And there was an effort to, I guess, sequester certain emails away from the probe. You can see, Coleman's Coleman's notes from October 4th contain the following entry. Anthony Weiner, unrelated, Anthony Weiner texting 15-year-old sexually explicit, initial analysis of laptop, thousands of emails, etc. But they had a conversation about which emails would be allowed to be looked at in this case and which would be, set aside. And that also raises a lot of questions. I mean, Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton exchanged thousands of emails, apparently, that were not, I don't think they were looked at in this investigation at all.
It's not surprising that this has fallen down the memory hole, because this has happened before with similar events. As I mentioned, a couple of items that were big in the news back in the late 80s, early 90s, but they've been forgotten. They predated the internet. But even, again, the Tchoupitoulas Parish case of the Hosanna Church in Louisiana back in 05, 06, somewhere in that time frame, where it was clear that there was evidence of occult rituals taking place in conjunction with child abuse, and that was swept under the rug. The police, the district attorney opted not to prosecute on that aspect, just focused on the child abuse aspect. These stories get pushed aside and pushed out of the mainstream. We get so focused on the stuff that gets thrown in front of us by the talking heads. All the major news networks will focus on the political aspect, the political game. We treat it like an ongoing sporting event. Who's got who's up and down in the polls, like we're watching the scores in a basketball game.
Right.
And we forget about these issues that keep bubbling under the surface. Every now and then something pokes its head through like this, briefly. It's like whack-a-mole. Boom, it's gone again. And we never hear from this again.
Right.
Now, I was going to say earlier, and the old preacher that I am, I preached myself off into a pig trail and forgot what I was going to say. We were with Colonel Maginnis yesterday. Anyway, so Joe and I took him back to the airport. He flew back. He went back to the Pentagon and was at the Pentagon. He talked to one of the agents there. Now, I have the guy's name and everything, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. But he did send me the email that he received from this guy, follow-up email. But he asked him point blank. He said, look, here's some of what is in the book Shadowland. He wrote the foreword for it. But it does make a compelling case that there is occult activity, satanic activity, more than just the pedophilism as far as people being attracted to minors. There's something deeper and darker about this for specific cause. And so he asks the guy, the agent at the Pentagon, and he says, do we... Because, the Pentagon's compartmentalized. You can have above top secret security clearance over here, but that don't mean you have this information over here. So he asks this guy, do we have anything that really does connect? Epstein, Maxwell, that circle of friends who people are going to learn about in the book Shadowland, do we have stuff that actually connects them to Satanism, to occult activity that also uses children? And he used profanity, not Colonel Maginnis, this other guy, but it was basically, bleep, yes, we do have files that directly connect them to occult activity, in addition to all of the other material that may come out sooner or later on Epstein.
Yes. And lest you think this is a political thing, left, right, it is not. I direct you back to the Washington Times article during the George H.W. Bush administration that revealed that a known homosexual male escort led underage boys on a midnight tour of the living quarters of the White House during the Republican administration of George H.W. Bush. This reaches the very top of American political society. It is not one party or the other. It is the evil underbelly of the political elite of not just America, but around the world. And we are trying to shine a light on it. Come quickly, Lord Jesus.
Amen.
Thank you for watching as we keep watch. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Skywatch TV. Your rights are being redefined as we speak by people who are serving, well, not the God that you're serving if you're watching this program. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me as we continue with our 4-week discussion, a powerful panel of best-selling authors, and I'm just honored to be here, part of it. First, introducing our CEO, best-selling author of a number of books, the brand new book, which is hard-hitting, it pulls no punches, names, Shadowland. We welcome Dr. Tom Horn back to Skywatch TV. Tom,
Great to be here with you guys.
the longtime pastor of Hickory Hammock Baptist Church, but also best-selling author in his own right, and the author of the brand new book, Masquerade, Pastor Carl Gallups. Carl, welcome.
Thank you, Derek. It's great to be here.
And a Pentagon insider, gentleman who is walking the halls of power. Pray for him because he's in the belly of the beast, as it were. He's the author of a couple of books that deal with this topic. First, The Deeper State. Most recently, Progressive Evil, one that's especially relevant as we head towards November. We welcome Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis back to Skywatch TV. Bob,
Thank you, Eric.
How are progressives redefining our rights? I mean, we've got the Constitution, and we believe that we've got certain rights that are inalienable, unchangeable in the Constitution. How are progressives in America working to redefine what we think are rights that just can't be changed?
Well, they go after rewriting the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and they go after our First Amendment rights, our faith rights, our religious freedom rights. They go after our Second Amendment rights. They go after our Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. They go after states' rights. They really try to literally rewrite the Constitution of the United States. Now, how do they do that? They captivate the institutions that have undergirded this country for so very long. They go after the family, redefining marriage. They redefine gender into a host of things. They go after our economy. They don't like capitalism. They want socialism, the redistribution of wealth across this country. Take from them and give it to someone else. They certainly go after religion. And they hate Christians. They literally hate Christians because they want to replace Christianity with big government, with progressivism. Progressivism is a religion. Progressivism has the Communist Manifesto as their word. It has their priests are the Hollywood icons, and the big cheese is much like Tom has been talking about in this culture. They go after all sorts of things. So it's classically a true religion with doctrines such as homosexuality, abortion on demand, and you name it. It's a long list that I go through in Progressive Evil. They certainly go after the government. Big government is the answer to all the social problems. It goes all the way back to Hegel. It goes back to Darwin, and to use big government and the power of the elite to manipulate the world. And of course, you are supposed to be bowing to them. They don't need these little bureaucracies out there. The massive bureaucracy in Washington is the answer. They're classically big federalists. And that's in part the kind of the battle that we had early on in our country between the anti-federalists, which were, I would call them conservatives, people that believed in states' rights, versus the people that believed in big government. So there are a host of those things. And then, of course, we have the ideals. They go after the ideals that made this country great. Individualism. They go after capitalism. They go after liberty and equality. And, the patriotism that really makes us distinctive. It's kind of not the existential, it's the exceptional nature of who we became, and they target every one of those. So this has been going on off and on, for well over a century and a half. It certainly had a high point in the progressive area of 1890 to 1920, and you had the likes of Theodore Roosevelt, then of course Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and of course 8 years of Obama, who's incredibly very progressive and incredibly very anti-Christian, as all the evidence shows. And so progressives have really reformed this country in a way that our founders would not recognize today, and they would object to that. And a new work which will probably say something about this summer. I'm working on one that focuses like a laser on the anti-Christian efforts of these progressives. These are the antichrists of this world, and they're all over, and they're doing great harm to who we are today. And they're rushing in the prophetic end times, there's no question.
John wrote that there were multiple antichrists already at work in the first century. Presumably those same spirits are the ones at work today. Yeah. The subtitle of your book, Progressive Evil, says the goal is to make America globally irrelevant for the end times. First of all, would they do that? Secondly, why would they care? Why would they want to make America irrelevant in the end times?
Well, because we have in the past been the conscience of the world to a large degree. We have been the shining light on the hill, as you may recall. We've done things that no other country in the world has ever done, and everyone wants to come here and has for the last couple of centuries. But things are beginning to change. They want to really diminish all of that and replace it with one world government. And they don't make any pretense about that. Certainly I address that in the deeper state and how the globalists have that in mind. But it's the progressive hand that's behind a lot of these globalists, whether they're the Rockefellers of the world or the Clintons or a host of other people that I know in Washington. The darkness of this is very real. And we need to recognize, as Tom has pointed out in the previous show, that this is a very, very serious spiritual battle. And yet, it seems to me that much of Christendom today, especially in this country, is absolutely blind to what is happening all about us. And these people that are pulling the levers of this progressive assault against not only President Trump, but also taking over our Congress. You've got the likes of this young lady from New York. You can't spell chaos without AOC. And, that's a reality today. And yet you have a lot of those types of people that have no touch with reality. I call them, in progressive evil and crazy. And they're delusional. They're like little brats. They really don't know the truth, and yet they make outlandish statements, and they have expectations that are beyond, reality. And so, yes, they are evil. They do the very things that my father says are wrong in his book, and yet, they contest that. We need to recognize what we're dealing with. It's a spiritual battle. They are evil, and they are crazy.
You mentioned Ocasio-Cortez. You also mentioned the acronym of her name, I guess. You can't spell chaos without it. But that literally, throughout history, it has shown that socialism, Marxism always ends not only in failure, but persecution of the righteous.
Oh, yes.
Always, right?
Absolutely.
There are bodies filling pits around the world throughout history as a result of where ultimately Marxism, socialism leads to. And I want to ask you, you were interviewed recently on progressive evil on a different program, but you made a comment that really stood out to me. And you said if the progressives get power and have their way, the Christians are going to wind up facing the same thing the Jews did in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. May I offer a biblical perspective to what he just said and what Tom just said? And that is, the Word of God, Paul specifically, he really, really laid out the prophecies of these times. Romans chapter 1 speaks of this depravity of mind that would sweep the globe, because when you look at it in the end time intent that it was meant, see, a lot of prophecy has a meaning in its day. So what Paul wrote to the church at Rome meant something then, but he's clearly speaking prophetically, because even when he writes Timothy, he says, look, the Spirit clearly says, in the last days, these things will happen. And it speaks of this selfishness, this craziness, this ugliness, this conceitedness, and this anti-God, a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. What's the power of real godliness? Jesus Christ, okay? So Paul tells us this. He tells us in the book of Romans that sexual depravity, sexual perversion will bring in a depraved mind, a spirit of depraved mind. And he says, and not only is God's wrath coming against these that do this, but those that support it. And so this is where we're living. Again, all of these elements have been around since the garden fall. Yeah. No question, through every culture. The thing that separates our times and our culture is the fact that these spirits, and that's what they are. Why is the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods, little g, before you, demons, spirits, before me, okay? But the reason these spirits are so ubiquitous now is because we're the first generation to see the return of Israel, which is certainly a prophetic demonic attraction. And then, of course, the instantaneous communication information systems that we have now that take these spirits and just broadcast them, glorify them. Movies, television, videos, video games, all over the internet. Children walking around in the jungles of the Amazon in Africa with cell phones, connected to the internet, watching this garbage, and that spirit just permeates. These are the days we're living in. What both of these men have just said is absolutely true, and the Word of God said that these days would come.
You know, what's horrific, not that any of it is any better than that, what Tom brings to attention is November of 1938, the Kristallnacht. And what I said in that program, and I'll say here, is that that was a special night in which the Nazi brown shirts went after the Jews. They broke into places, they pulled people out, they killed a lot of people, they incarcerated a lot, and they shipped a lot off to prison camps. Now, what I said basically is, progressives hate Christians. They worship their own power. They have every intention of being totally in charge. Given the opportunity, because the progression is, especially under Obama, and it stopped, obviously, under the current president, because he's reversing a lot of things. But if Hillary Clinton had stayed in power, it would have progressed in a way that was very ugly. And I can see the day coming where they'll knock on doors, because you're an outspoken Christian, a fundamentalist Christian who believes in the Bible, believes in Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins, and they will come for us. And that's the thing that I said. We need to recognize, much like I said earlier, there's a stark blindness in this country about what's happening all about us. There are people that are mind controls, and they're doing things that are desperately evil. And we need to recognize that as Christians. And yet we're unplugged, I think. We're happy to go and do our little thing on Sunday, but that's the extent of who we are.
You could see this reflected in the recent impeachment hearings, where basically the leaders of the left wing were saying, if you don't do this the way we want it, even if it means we have to move outside of the president's constitutional rights, then you are involved in a cover-up, and you have got to go down, and he has got to be removed. So that spirit is really there. And if you go back and study what happened with the rise of Nazi Germany, that's what happened. It came in, it's all these rousing conversations, and Hitler's out there with this bullhorn. They're talking about nationalism. They're couching it all, making people feel like this is going to be great for the country, but ultimately, and by the way, they started with Germans. They murdered, millions of Germans in addition to the Jews that were put to death.
The only regret that Adolf Hitler said, according to one of his ministers, is that Germany didn't embrace Islam, because Islam is so hard on people, makes things happen, and Christianity is weak. So you can see where this crazy person came from and how they wanted to manipulate that population for greater power throughout Western Europe. And of course, that led to World War II. We face a very dire situation here. And like I say, I don't think most people realize how seriously this is, and it must be understood.
And today's church takes the declaration of what you just said, Ephesians 6. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. Yes, we see it lived in the flesh and blood, this dimension of reality in which we're living, but this dimension of reality is a fallen one. And Satan is named in the scriptures as being the God of this age, little g. But we're not supposed to have any other gods before us if we are believers. But we're living in this. That's why Paul tried so desperately to warn the church at Ephesus, and thus all the churches as that letter circulated, thus even our day, because so much of it is prophetic.